the Boston Tea Party of 1773. That autumn, a flyer was nailed on people's front doors and on trees all over Boston in the middle of the night, signed by an enigmatic character who went under the pseudonym Rusticus. There's still some debate about who he really was. It said, "Make sure that your watchmen be instructed as they go on their rounds to call out every night, 12:30, beware of the East India Company." The East India Company? Conventional wisdom has it that the 1773 Tea Act, a tax law passed in London that led right to the Boston Tea Party, was simply an increase in the taxes on tea paid by American colonists. In reality, however, the Tea Act gave the world's largest transnational corporation, the British East India Company, the biggest corporate tax break in world history. It was an actual tax refund on millions of pounds of tea they were unable to sell, and they were holding in inventory and would have been billions in today's dollars. So why did the American colonists get so angry about a corporate tax cut that they'd commit a multi-million-dollar, in today's money, act of vandalism against the company and thus light the fuse for the Revolutionary War? I couldn't find a ready answer on the web or in any American history textbooks back about a decade ago when I was writing What Would Jefferson Do? They all seem to either incorrectly suggest that the Tea Act of 1773 was a tax increase that set off the Tea Partiers protesting, or they ignored it altogether. So when I found in an antiquarian bookstore in London an original first edition of one of this nation's earliest history books, I had to buy it to learn the real story of the Boston Tea Party and the subsequent American Revolution. This is an original copy of Retrospect of the Boston Tea Party, with a memoir of George R.T. Hewes, a survivor, this is the full title of it, a survivor of the little band of patriots who drowned the tea in Boston Harbor in 1773. Because the identity of the Boston Tea Party participants were hidden, other than Sam Adams, and all were sworn to secrecy for the next 50 years, this account is singularly rare and important, as it's the only actual first-person account of the Tea Party by any of the participants who were there that exists to this day. And turning its brittle, age-covered, wrinkly pages and looking at printing on unevenly sized sheets, typeset by hand, you could, I don't know if you can see this, it's literally different sizes. I mean, this is printed on small hand presses almost 200 years ago, was both fascinating and exciting. Although George Robert Twelves Hewes' name is today largely lost in history, he was actually quite well known in colonial times and during the early 19th century. For example, when young Paul Revere went off to join the army, he took Hewes along with him. After escaping from the British fleet to join the rebels, General George Washington and his wife Martha took Hewes into their home for a few days. Washington called Hewes a man who was amazingly good-natured, and Hewes said that Madam Washington waited upon them at table at dinner time and was remarkably social. And it was Hewes and this book that named what Thomas Jefferson in all of his writings and speeches always referred to as the incident in Boston Harbor into something called the Boston Tea Party. Hewes literally coined the phrase. And here's why he dressed up like an Indian and showed up for the Tea Party. The East India Company was trying to corner the tea market. After all, it was the drink of choice of the colonists, and there was pretty much a tea shop on every corner in America. We imported millions of pounds of tea every year, and most of it was brought in by small American entrepreneurs, what the British called smugglers. And the East India Company wanted to put those smugglers out of business. And their strategy? Undercut their prices. They wanted to pull a Walmart. But the colonists were having none of it. As Hewes wrote, trying to get around the East India Company, quote, rendered the smuggling of tea an object that was frequently practiced, and their resolutions against using it, the colonists' resolutions against using the tea, had greatly diminished the importation into the colonies of this commodity. In other words, the colonists' boycott was hurting the East India Company. Meanwhile, Hewes noted, an immense quantity of it accumulated in the warehouses of the East India Company in England. This company petitioned the king, he writes, to suppress the duty of 3 pence per pound upon its introduction into America. That petition by the corporation was successful. It's known as the Tea Act of 1773, and the result was great for the transnational East India Company and a big problem for the American entrepreneurs. As Hewes again writes in his book, the East India Company, however, received permission to transport tea free from all duty from Great Britain to America, allowing it to wipe out its small competitors and take over the tea business in all of America. They got their tax cut, and now they were going to underprice and put the smugglers out of business. Hence, Hewes writes, it was no longer the small vessels of private merchants who went to vend tea for their own account in the ports of the colonies, but on the contrary, ships of an enormous burthen that transported immense quantities of this commodity amassed in suitable magazines. Hewes wrote, accordingly, the company sent its agents at Boston, New York, and Philadelphia 600 chests of tea and a proportionate number to Charleston and other maritime cities of the American continent. The colonies, this is Hewes writing in his book, the colonies were now arrived at the decisive moment when they must cast the die and determine their course. At New York, Captain Sears and McDougall, daring and enterprising men, effected a concert of will against the East India Company between the smugglers, the merchants, and the Sons of Liberty, by the way, who had all joined forces at that point, in most cases were the same people. Back to Hewes. Pamphlets suited to the conjecture were daily distributed, and nothing was left unattempted by popular leaders to attain their purpose. You get it? Resistance was organizing and growing, and the Tea Act was the final straw. The citizens of the colonies were preparing to throw off one of the corporations that for almost 200 years had determined nearly every aspect of their lives through its economic and political power. They were planning to destroy the goods of the world's largest multinational corporation, to intimidate its employees, and to face down the guns of the government that supported it. A pamphlet was circulated throughout the colonies called The Alarm and signed by our enigmatic Rusticus. It left no doubt about how the small American tea shop entrepreneurs felt about this giant corporation trying to run them out of business. Rusticus wrote, and again, this appeared on trees and front doors all over Boston, are we in like manner to be given up to the disposal of the East India Company, who have now the assurance to step forth in aid of the minister to execute his plan of enslaving America? Their conduct in Asia for some years past has given simple proof how little they regard the laws of nations, the rights, liberties, and lives of men. 1,500,000, it is said, perished by famine in 1 year, not because the earth denied its fruits, but because this company and their servants engulfed all the necessities of life and set them at so high a price that the poor could not purchase them. The pamphleteering worked. After the colonists turned back the East India Company's ships in Philadelphia and New York, Hewes continues. In Boston, the general voice declared the time was come to face the storm. This was the voice of the Bostonians in 1773, wrote Hewes. A guard was, this is incredible, this is the actual story from the one guy who was actually there. A guard was placed on Griffin's Wharf, near where the tea ships were moored. It was agreed that a strict watch would be kept, that if any insult should be offered, the bell should be immediately rung to call for the assistance of the country people. Rusticus added his voice with a pamphlet saying, resolve, therefore, nobly resolve, and publish to the world your resolutions that no man will receive the tea, no man will let his stores or suffer the vessel that brings it to moor at his wharf. Another pamphlet titled The Alarm, probably written by Samuel Adams, although we don't know for sure, also appeared on trees and houses on October 27, 1773. It said, it hath now been proved to you that the East India Company obtained the monopoly of that trade by bribery and corruption. that the power thus obtained they have prostituted to extortion and other the most cruel and horrible purposes the sun ever beheld. And then, Hewes says, on a cold November evening, the first of the East India Company's ships of tax-free tea arrived. On the 28th of November, 1773, Hewes writes, the ship Dartmouth, with 112 chests, arrived. It was now evening, and I immediately dressed myself in the costume of an Indian, equipped with a small hatchet and club, after having painted my face and hands with coal dust in the shop of a blacksmith. I repaired to Griffin's Wharf, where the ships lay that contained the tea. When I first appeared in the street after being thus disguised, I fell in with many others who were dressed, equipped, and painted as I was, and who fell in with me, and we marched in order to the place of our destination. When we arrived at the wharf, they divided us into 3 parties for the purpose of boarding the 3 ships, which contained the tea at the same time. The name of him who commanded the division to which I was assigned was Leonard Pitt. The names of the other commanders I never knew. Hewes, this is still from the guy who was there, George Robert Twelves Hewes. He was 17 at the time. We were immediately ordered by the respective commanders to board all the ships at the same time, which we promptly obeyed. The commander of the division to which I belonged, as soon as we were on board the ship, appointed me boatswain and ordered me to go to the captain and demand of him the keys to the hatches and a dozen candles. I made the demand accordingly, and the captain promptly replied and delivered the articles, but requested me at the same time to do no damage to the ship or its rigging. We then were ordered by our commander to open the hatches and take out all the chests of tea and throw them overboard. And we immediately proceeded to execute his orders, first cutting and splitting open the chests with our tomahawks so as thoroughly to expose them to the effects of the water. In about 3 hours from the time we went on board, we had thus broken and thrown overboard every tea chest to be found on the ship, while those on the other ships were disposing of the tea in the same way at the same time. We were surrounded by British armed ships, but no attempt was made to resist us. He notes, we then quietly retired to our several places of residence without having any conversation with each other or taking any measures to discover who were our associates. There appeared to be an understanding that each individual should volunteer his services, keep his own secret, and risk the consequences for himself. No disorder took place during that transaction, and it was observed at that time that it was the stillest night that had ensued that Boston had enjoyed for many months. George Robert Twelves Hewes. In all, the 342 chests of tea, over 90,000 pounds, thrown overboard that night were enough to make 24 million cups of tea and were valued by the East India Company at 9,659 pounds sterling, or in today's currency, just over $1 million. In response to the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament immediately passed the Boston Ports Act, stating that the port of Boston would be closed until the citizens of Boston reimbursed the East India Company for the tea they destroyed. The colonists refused. A year and a half later, the colonists, still refusing to reimburse the corporation, again openly stated their defiance of the East India Company in Great Britain by taking on British troops in an armed conflict at Lexington and Concord. The shots heard around the world on April 19th, 1775. So there you have it, the Boston Tea Party. It was a revolt against corporate power and corporate tax cuts, from the mouth of the man who was there that night. And today, it seems as if this generation of Tea Partiers, as they begin to slowly realize that their so-called movement is being funded by America's second largest privately held corporation and its owners, the East India Company of today, that maybe they're beginning to wake up. There was a Tea Party event scheduled today for Washington, D.C., and so few people showed up that Fox News, which had sent a satellite truck and was intending to break into their news with the coverage, gave up and went home. It's time the truth of the real Boston Tea Party came out. Spread the word.